Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Centretown Community Health Centre for the launch of the Ottawa People's Commission report, Part 1. Before we begin today, I would just like to start with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge and honour that we hold this meeting on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Owusu-Akyeeah Nation. To be present on this land is a privilege, and we thank the Algonquin Owusu-Akyeeah people for providing us with the opportunity to live, learn, work, and play here. Nous voudrions souligner et honorer le fait que nous tenons cette réunion sur le territoire non cédé et non abandonné de la nation algonquine Owusu-Akyeeah. Être représent sur sa terre est un privilège et nous remercions le peuple algonquin Owusu-Akyeeah de nous avoir donné la possibilité d'y vivre, d'y prendre, d'y travailler et de nous y divertir. The fact that we are speaking today about one kind of occupation, it is important to situate this work with the acknowledgement that as Canadians, we are also occupying the lands of many Indigenous people. I am pleased today to welcome you to the launch of Part 1 of the Ottawa People's Commission on the one-year anniversary of the Convoy Occupation. This is significant, as I was talking with staff and people last week as we approached the anniversary, and many of them spoke about the feelings of unease and the tension that they were feeling in their bodies as they remembered what it was like a year ago. I believe this work is an important part of the healing process. During the occupation and for weeks afterwards, clients, community members and staff spoke about the need to document and hear about their experiences, in large part because our voices were not heard and reflected as the police and many of the politicians made decisions on how to respond to this event. Our experiences were minimized as they went on television and proclaimed this to be a non-violent protest. It was not. When we were approached to support an Ottawa People's Commission, we stepped up to take this work on as a community-driven initiative of the Community Health Centre to support and foster safe spaces for civic discourse. S'engager en faveur de la santé et du bien-être signifie s'assurer que nos rues et nos espaces communautaires sont des espaces sûrs pour tous. Il ne fait aucun doute que l'occupation de Convoy a eu un impact négatif important sur la santé physique, émotionnelle et mentale de nombreuses personnes qui vivaient et travaillaient dans le quartier de la ville, pas seulement le centre-ville, qui ont été touchés par les événements de l'année dernière. A commitment to health and well-being means ensuring that our streets and our community spaces are safe spaces for everyone. There is no doubt that the impact of the Convoy Occupation had a significant negative impact on the physical, emotional, and mental health of many of the people who lived and worked in the areas in the city, not just Centretown, that were impacted by the events of last year. We are pleased to see this report come forward and are honored to be a part of supporting this incredible testimony. Thank you for joining us here today, and I turn it over to Gail Maduri, our wonderful project coordinator, to lead us through today.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Merci à toutes et à tous de nous joindre ici aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Gaëlle Mudéry. Je suis la coordinatrice de projet pour la Commission populaire d'Ottawa. My name is Gaëlle Mudéry. I am the project coordinator for the People's Commission. Before I hand it over to our commissioners, I'd like to just give a brief overview of some of the work that the Commission has undertaken since its inception in June of 2022. So the OPC was launched in June of 2022 with a view of creating a space for residents and business owners who live, work, and play in Ottawa-Gatineau for healing and accountability in the aftermath of February 2022's Convoy Occupation. Community members came together, and it was clear that there was still extensive trauma stemming from the harm people had experienced and the feeling of abandonment and not being heard. The OPC has operated as a program of the Centretown Community Health Centre, which has worked with local residents to bring this vision of a People's Commission to life. Le mandat de la Commission populaire d'Ottawa est de créer un espace pour les résidents locaux et les propriétaires d'entreprises afin qu'ils puissent partager leurs expériences du convoi ainsi que des recommandations pour éviter que cela ne se reproduise. Our 4 commissioners held public hearings starting in September of 2022 until mid-December of 2022. They heard from over 200 people by way of 14 hearings, 8 community consultation, and over 75 written submissions. 2 of those public hearings were dedicated to local residents who supported the aims and actions of the convoy, as we recognize that there are differing perspectives about this event in our city. La CPO présente son rapport final en 2 parties. Cette première partie est principalement une réflexion de ce que les commissaires ont entendu de la communauté. OPC is presenting its final report in 2 parts. This first part is primarily a reflection of what we heard from the community, and part 2 will be released in late March, and will offer further analysis and propose relevant recommendations. This report is already available on our website, opc-cpo.ca. And I will turn it over to our commissioners, who will speak more in depth about their findings at this point.
Thanks, Gail. Am I live? Yes. I'm Leilani Farha. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I was very proud and am very proud to serve as a commissioner for the OPC CPO. Many terms were used to describe what played out on the streets of downtown Ottawa a year ago. Freedom convoy, demonstration, protest. The term that we have settled on to describe what happened is occupation. We reached this conclusion based on the evidence that was before us. Residents did not experience this like a benign convoy, and it was very different from a peaceful or even legitimately provocative protest or demonstration. Residents told us they felt their city had been invaded and was under siege. They used the word occupation, referencing the protracted nature of the events. They described how their communities had been taken over by force, how they became prisoners in their own homes, how their mobility throughout the city was severely obstructed and prevented, and how they experienced violence, trauma, and fear on the streets of their own neighborhoods. We know that occupation is a very serious term. As human rights lawyers and advocates, we understand well its meaning in international law during times of conflict. While we are not invoking it as such, the People's Commission considers it to be an apt and accurate description of what people endured. Before closing, the Commissioners note that the term occupation resonates powerfully with Indigenous peoples whose unceded lands and territories have been taken over and come under the authority of an external force, including here in Ottawa. During the occupation of Ottawa, Indigenous leaders were not meaningfully consulted or engaged by convoy organizers or participants. Their traditional protocols around Indigenous ceremonies were not respected or followed, and their banners and messages were co-opted and misused. It is our conclusion that downtown Ottawa was occupied by the convoy. Thank you.
Good morning, bonjour. Je m'appelle Monia Mazigh, je suis autrice et universitaire. From September 22nd, 2022 until the second week of December of the same year, I had the privilege to hear several Ottawa residents who were affected by the convoy. Except for a few numbers who described the convoy as liberating them from the COVID-19 restrictive measures and their insistence that the convoy brought a fun atmosphere to Ottawa similar to that of Canada Day celebrations, a majority of testimonies emphasized on the violence that accompanied the convoy and its supporters. Starting with the trucks that blocked the roads, the driveways, and the sidewalks, not knowing what was inside of them, with the possible scenario that they can be transformed into harmful weapons at any moment, moving to the horns that were blown constantly from as early as 7 in the morning to the late hours at night, at a decibel range between 100 to 150, very damageable to human audition and mental health. To residents being followed and scared with speeding trucks for wearing masks, finishing with women being sexually harassed while racialized people and people with disability being mocked and verbally or physically threatened. Pendant l'occupation d'Ottawa par le convoi des camions, nous avons noté que la violence remplissait à la fois les rues d'Ottawa autant que la peur qui remplissait les cœurs de plusieurs de ses résidentes. Cette violence, qui a pris la forme de klaxonnements continus du matin au soir, n'a malheureusement pas été immédiatement stoppée par les autorités, ni par les agents de police qui ont été à maintes fois décrits par plusieurs témoignages comme des observateurs passifs, parfois même sympathiques aux supporters du convoi, ni par les politiciens qui ont mis plus que 3 longues semaines pour finalement commencer à prendre des décisions qui ont abouti au démantèlement de cette occupation. Hearing the residents of Ottawa testifying about their disappointments and frustrations, that their fear and anxiety about the surrounding violence they experienced during the convoy occupation were not taken seriously, literally being gaslighted. I felt that this was in total contrast to the peaceful protest that was often described to us by some media or by some politicians. In a time where the accuracy of information is not only needed but required, those powerful and detailed testimonies by many residents of Ottawa came to enlighten us about the real situation on the ground and gave us a clear picture and a thorough understanding of what happened during this occupation, whether in flags, obscene language, speeding cars, confrontation and sexual harassment and intimidation. Violence was everywhere and left unchallenged.
Good morning. My name is Alex Neve. I'm a human rights lawyer and a professor of international human rights law at the University of Ottawa. The people of Ottawa were abandoned during the convoy occupation. In a time of crisis, people expect to be able to turn to police and government for support. And when that crisis involves violence, threats, harassment, and other human rights abuses committed by private groups and individuals, there is a right to be protected from those harms. That did not happen during the convoy occupation. Quite the contrary, particularly during the first 3 weeks, there was a stunning dereliction of this essential human rights responsibility by police and officials at all 3 levels of government. Les gens ne se sentaient pas en sécurité et protégés. Ils ont estimé qu'ils n'avaient pas d'importance. Ils se sont sentis abandonnés. Ce sentiment d'abandon est peut-être le sentiment que nous avons entendu plus fréquemment et systématiquement que presque toute autre chose, de la part de nombreuses personnes qui ont partagé leur expérience avec nous. Abandoned in that criminal laws and municipal bylaws were not enforced, intentionally so. People were rebuffed and discouraged when they tried to report assaults, threats, and other crimes, or parking, noise, and public safety infractions. Officers told them they were awaiting orders. Abandoned in that essential services were canceled and cut back, leaving vulnerable members of the community, including people with disabilities, virtually imprisoned in their homes, unable to access vital transit and medical appointments, crucial social programs, or even to reach grocery stores and pharmacies. abandoned in that nothing was being done to address the impact of intolerable noise and visible threatening symbols and messages of hate, racism, and intolerance. Community members themselves had to mount a heroic private court challenge to stop the torturous levels of honking. Abandoned in that they were not provided regular, reliable information about what was happening so that store owners could make informed decisions about whether or not to open for business, and residents could decide if it was safe enough to even go out their front door. La communauté a été abandonnée, mais ils ont regardé les camions entrer dans la ville, dirigés vers les endroits pour se garer et installer des camps de base. Abandonnés alors que certains policiers ont été vus en train de rire et de poser pour des selfies avec des participants au convoi. There were exceptions. Notably, we heard much appreciation for the efforts of downtown city councillors who responded to community needs. That was absolutely the exception, not even remotely close to the rule. The challenges were considerable. Of course they were. There were perhaps missteps early on that allowed the convoy to get too entrenched too quickly. But abandonment is not the answer to any of that. Abandonment is an unjustifiable human rights failure. It cannot be allowed to happen again. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity and a passionate activist and advocate here in Ottawa. My colleagues have all spoken about what we've heard over the last few months, stories around the fact that residents felt and experienced a siege in their own community, that folks witnessed hate and violence and experienced harassment in their own communities, and that the abandonment from police and decision makers, especially at a time where folks were dealing with inaccess to basic resources like groceries, medical appointments, and other services that they depend on for their own survival. This was a constant theme we heard that result in a lot of frustration, isolation, and anger. But what we really heard over the last few months with regards to how people dealt with this is an excellent story around people's ability to mobilize and create communities of care that was completely absent in stories around citizens and residents' experience of the occupation. It was community mobilization that resulted in different buildings coming together for food share programs that they created as a result of some of the most vulnerable people in those buildings not being able to get groceries or medication. It was community mobilization with some of these city councilors and representatives who actually showed up that resulted in a lovely network of safe walks for some of the most marginalized folks, including LGBTQ people that we heard from, racialized folks that we heard from. It was community mobilization that involved people putting their own selves at risk to get information and to share it online when we weren't getting that from the services that we depend on every day. And it was community mobilization at a point where frustration was at its peak, where community members got together in what we've appropriately titled the Battle of Billings Bridge to physically block the further occupation of our city. It's that story of the community response and ability to come together in the absence of leadership from our decision makers that was completely absent in much of the public discourse around the occupation. This is what we've heard, and this is what we've been able to package together in this report that we're sharing with you all today. We're really excited to have all of these stories heard from community members who felt silence for over a year, not only during that time in February, but also along all these other public discussions around the occupation and its impact. It's the community impact that is super important, and the community's response that I believe, and I think collectively believe, shows a beautiful lesson that there's something to learn from listening and working in collaboration with community. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, and sincere thanks to your colleagues as well for your commitment to this work. I'll open the floor to questions at this point. If you would like to ask a question, I'll just ask that you direct yourself to the microphone at the left of the room. Je vais ouvrir la salle aux questions. Si vous aimeriez poser une question, je vous inviterai à vous présenter au microphone à la gauche de la salle, s'il vous plaît.
Hi, my name is Cindy Tran. I'm with the Canadian Press. Something that stood out to me as you're mentioning, I haven't been able to read the report just yet, but you did say a lot of people in the community decided to mobilize. And what does that say about our justice system, especially with, there's been a lot of trouble with OPS. What does it say about them if residents have to feel so unsafe that they decide to take things into their own hands?
I think there's a fundamental connection to the theme I was highlighting around abandonment and the powerful comments you heard from my colleague Debbie about community mobilization. I think in many respects the two did go hand in hand, including with respect to the justice system. And I think it's well known, for instance, that it had to be the community that mobilized heroic and brave efforts on the part of community members, incredible effort on the part of community-based lawyers, to be the ones who actually finally took this to court to try to get a legal response to one aspect, the torturous levels of honking and blaring of horns that people were enduring. I think that's a perfect example of the abandonment and failure of the systems that should have, including through the justice system, been responding and keeping people safe, and instead an incredible mobilization that happens to fill that gap.
And are there recommendations that the Commission might have for that in terms of the failure, that abandonment, that other people outside of the system had to step up?
Our recommendations are going to come in the next report, so stay tuned, I guess, is part of the message there. I mean, the broad message around abandonment is that can never be the response to a situation like this. We heard very often from people recounting what they were told by police, etc., that they were waiting for orders, that they didn't want to inflame the situation. Those may all be legitimate operational constraints and challenges, but it can never be the end of the story, and that needs to change.
And, sorry.
Can I just add to that? I think one of the stories here is a story that's not actually unique to this situation, which is in Canada, some human rights seem to matter more than other human rights. So what we saw during the occupation was a bending over backward by police and by government officials to ensure that the right to protest, the right to free expression was upheld. But what we didn't see was an equal move by governments and police to ensure that people's rights to food, housing or peaceful housing, and health care, for example, and safety were upheld. And the idea that, I mean, we do want to celebrate what communities can do and community mobilization, but that is a typical charitable, relying on a charitable response to a systemic thing that's happening.
And if I may, one other question. I know there's a line behind me, but I am curious to know what are the long-term impacts that this occupation, as you're calling it, has had on residents, because we've approached the one-year anniversary. There were protesters over the weekend. Wellington Street has been closed for over a year. I want to hear some thoughts on that.
That's an excellent question with regards to the long-term impacts. And throughout our testimonies and some of the written reports, you know, folks have shared with us the lingering feelings and impacts of the trucker convoy on them, whether it's a result of hearing, that actual physical impacts that it had on people, around people's assessment and trust of institutions, and I think that's the big one. One of the linkages that we've been talking about a lot, especially in some of our more focused groups where we spoke to particular community members who experienced the convoy very differently, was that they have always had an ongoing critique of certain systems as a result of their lived experience. What we were hearing from others is that they now have this realization that these systems or these institutions may not have been set up that way to hear us or to be there for us. And so a lot more people are more engaged in asking questions and demanding accountability. There's physical changes in our city that have changed even discourse around policy, around how city layouts are laid out. There's an ongoing conversation, and I think the long impact is wanting a question of how we can ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Avantika, and I'm with CBC. My first question for you guys is kind of, what is the plan for this report? What is the end goal? I understand that the recommendations are coming out in March. Who are they going to be laid in front of?
First of all, this first report is very important for the community. I think the plan is to share it with the community, with the groups, with right now with the city councillor, with politicians, with people who were affected. I think it is very important to remember that many people that we heard during their testimony felt that they were unheard, that they felt that they were not taken seriously. So as a first step, we would like to make sure to tell them that we heard you, that we are basically documenting what happened to them, and we would like to share it with the whole community. This is the first step. The second step, once we are going to finish our second report, our plan is to share it with politicians, to the police, also the Ottawa police, obviously, to other groups who are involved to the city officials as well, because they are part of what happened during that occupation, and make sure that first of all, this is not just a recommendation. We would like them to take them seriously, eventually to implement them and to make the changes that people were asking for.
Pourriez-vous le faire en français?
La même chose?
Oui, c'est ça.
D'accord. Alors, ça, c'est une première partie du rapport. Donc, nous avons entendu ce que les citoyens, les résidents d'Ottawa, des zones affectées par le convoi, nous les avons entendus, nous avons documenté ce qu'ils nous ont rapporté et nous l'avons écrit dans notre rapport avec 4 sections, 4 thèmes importants qui est l'occupation, la violence, l'abandon, et la mobilisation de la communauté. Donc, c'est très important qu'on sache et qu'on se rappelle de ce qui s'est passé à Ottawa. C'est la première partie. Donc, on aimerait que ce que nous avons entendu soit partagé avec les agences qui sont qui sont en relation avec les citoyens, les agences locales, avec la police, avec la ville d'Ottawa. Et donc, ça, c'est notre dire à nos citoyens que leurs expériences sont bien réelles et que la violence, que tous ces thèmes-là sont bien réels et malheureusement ont eu lieu. Notre deuxième partie, deuxième volet de notre rapport viendra à la fin du mois de mars et nous espérons le partager également avec la ville d'Ottawa, avec les politiciens et avec les services de police d'Ottawa, parce que nous pensons que ce sont ces 3 parties ou ces 3 catégories qui ont vraiment besoin de prendre ces recommandations, de les prendre sérieusement et de les mettre en place.
Just as kind of a follow to that, I understand that, if I'm understanding right, actually, the purpose of this report is both to make community members feel heard and seen, but also to push for change. While I understand the recommendations are still yet to come, what does that change look like? Can you give me an overview of the change you're pushing for?
we probably could all jump in on this, but maybe I'll start the ball rolling. I think for us, and you've already heard this to a certain degree, this absolutely all comes down to human rights. Everything about how the convoy unfolded, how officials at all three orders of government and police at all three orders of government responded, shines a glaring spotlight on a colossal human rights failure. A human rights failure that is relevant to each of those levels of government, and perhaps even more significantly in terms of how those levels of government come together, coordinate, collaborate. So certainly, as we formulate more specific recommendations, it will very much be speaking to that. How is it possible that, number one, human rights weren't even in the frame as police and authorities were ascertaining how to respond to this, how to get ready for it, even before it arrived? And how is it that for several weeks, human rights were utterly, deliberately abandoned for some of the most vulnerable members of our community? That is what needs attention, and it's not just by saying some aspirational feel-good words about human rights. We need action that's going to make sure human rights are at the heart of how we set budgets, how we set priorities, how we design programs, how we deliver services in this city, good times and bad times, convoy or no convoy.
Sorry, can I just...
Absolutely.
That was just a beautiful summary, so thank you for that, Alex. None of this is rehearsed. We're getting it all real time. But I would just add to that, the way I envision this is, you know, what would it have looked like if governments and the police had in mind human rights outcomes at the end of all of this? It completely reorients, as Alex just eloquently described, reorients the allocation of resources, how community was engaged, especially the most vulnerable. I mean, it's very, I mean, we haven't talked about in any granular sense because it's a press conference, but it's a very serious thing that happened when you think about, we heard of homeless people disappearing, gone missing. I mean, these are very, very serious things. Persons with disabilities trapped in their own homes, unable to get to very serious and important medical appointments, not able to access food, paratransport or paratranspo, suspended, right? None of that leads to human rights outcomes when you're making those decisions and allowing those things to happen.
My final question for you guys is kind of in two parts. The first, any of you are welcome to take this one on. What did you make of the demonstrations this weekend?
I think we said it from the beginning that Ottawa is a place where people are used to protests, and we heard it from the local residents. And people, some of the people, when the convoy first arrived, they thought that this is going to be, I mean, some of them even supported the idea that to have this protest in town. However, when they saw that this protest was mainly more described as an entitlement, as a siege, as an occupation, with people desecrating some sites, with people really like having those bonfires, acting in a very dangerous way. I think this is where a lot of them, and even those who maybe initially supported the idea of the protest, started to have a different opinion. So I think, yes, everybody has the right to protest. Everybody has the right to have their own opinion. What we have seen and what we have heard from the local residents is totally different from a simple protest or a peaceful protest. So I think people coming and protesting, it's absolutely their rights. However, it's when the rights of some are going to be imposed on the rest of the majority, and not only imposed, but also behaving like they own the place and discrediting some place, and then using, appropriating some cultural like symbols, and having Nazi symbols, and having all sort of hates displayed on the street. This is, I think, where our opinion is going to differ, and whether, as my colleague pointed out rightfully, where we have a problem, obviously, and where we really need a human right approach to assess all these rights and make sure that nobody is going to be hurt or nobody is going to be really suffering while others are going to impose their rules on them.
And I think we also need to remember that just because it didn't become a repeat of what happened last year, just because we did see, obviously, more decisive enforcement action from the police, does not at all mean it's fixed. And I think there's a risk of there being an assumption that it's all the lessons have been learned, we didn't have Convoy 2.0, thus we can move on. And I think what we were hearing from residents about that utter deep failure of human rights still lingers, and that needs action.
If I'm not taking up too much time, I will
Usually just two questions and then let's roll and come back.
Yeah.
Ouais. Oui, bonjour, Rémi Autier, Radio-Canada. J'étais là lors de la première rencontre et il y avait au moins une personne qui était favorable à ce qui s'est passé ici. C'est peut-être une minorité, les camionneurs qui sont venus sont peut-être une minorité, mais quelle place avez-vous fait dans votre rapport à cette partie des gens-là qui ont vécu un moment qui, pour eux, a été vu d'une façon très positive, ou avez-vous ignoré ces commentaires?
Je l'ai déjà mentionné dans mon introduction que nous avons bel et bien entendu ces voix-là. Nous en avons parlé dans notre rapport, donc vous pouvez le lire et le consulter. On a parlé de ce que ces gens, ceux qui supportaient, ceux qui étaient en faveur des camionneurs. On a entendu des gens dire qu'ils se sont sentis libérés par les camionneurs. On a entendu dire que c'était une ambiance festive, bon enfant. On avait entendu que des gens, pendant les 2 ans des règles strictes de la Covid, se sont sentis emprisonnés dans leur maison, et donc la venue des camionneurs était vue par eux comme une façon libératrice. On en a parlé, on l'a dit, sauf que on n'a pas pensé, on n'a pas compris que ça représentait la majorité des personnes qui sont venues témoigner. Et nous avons aussi parfois noté quelques, disons, contradictions ou exagérations. Parce que, rappelez-vous bien, vous étiez là le premier jour du début des consultations ou des témoignages. Nous l'avons dit, eh bien, expliquer aux gens que notre mandat n'est pas un mandat pour dire qu'on est pour les règles de la Covid, les mesures restrictives, ou on est contre. On est là pour entendre les impacts que les citoyens ont vécu au centre-ville d'Ottawa et dans les quartiers proches. Donc, on l'a noté dans notre rapport et on l'a bien souligné. Et donc, ces voix-là, on ne les a pas du tout supprimées, on les a mis là-bas et voilà.
Deuxième question. Votre rapport semble, et comme mes collègues, je pense qu'on n'a pas eu le temps de tout le lire, là, mais semble assez critique de certaines institutions, les réactions politiques, les réactions de la police, la réaction de certains services d'urgence. On a entendu et on a exploré ces critiques beaucoup avec la commission Rouleau. En quoi votre rapport se distingue et vient compléter ou ajouter ou prend une approche différente du rapport Rouleau qui, on ne l'a pas encore lu, mais s'est penché sur les actions de ces groupes-là?
Alex, tu veux prendre ça?
Je crois que la différence très importante est que pendant nos sessions, nous avons complètement concentré sur la perspective des gens, des résidents, de la communauté. C'était clair que dans les autres processus, comme l'enquête de M. de la Justice Rouleau, l'espace pour les perspectives des gens qui vivent dans les communautés impactées était très peu. Et pour nous, c'était notre mandat, mais c'est clair que pour vraiment comprendre une situation comme l'occupation du convoi, nous devons commencer avec la perspective des gens qui ont vécu cette réalité quotidienne. Alors, c'est vraiment ça, la différence entre les deux.
Et j'aimerais rajouter aussi, parce que vous avez dit qu'est-ce que notre rapport serait, comment est-ce que notre rapport serait différent du rapport de la commission du juge Rouleau. Nous ne prétendons pas du tout être une commission d'enquête. Nous sommes une commission populaire, donc nous n'allons pas rentrer dans les détails légaux, juridiques, sauf que nous avons une vision générale de ce qui a marché et de ce qui n'a pas marché, surtout en termes de coordination entre les différents niveaux comme la ville, les policiers, les politiciens. Donc, dans notre prochain rapport, nous allons vraiment insister sur qu'est-ce qui n'a pas vraiment marché, toute la question de communication, toute la question aussi de coordination entre les différentes agences, toute la question aussi de communication avec la population. Parce que l'abandon, c'est que les gens n'ont jamais reçu de communication de la ville, de la police. Et donc, c'est ça le sentiment d'abandon. Donc, dans ce sens-là, j'espère que vous allez être là quand on va écrire et publier notre deuxième rapport. Et donc, nous allons vraiment insister sur ces points-là en tant que la relation entre les agences et les citoyens. Qu'est-ce qui a marché et qu'est-ce qui n'a pas marché?
Merci.
Elaine McGregor, Centertown Buzz. I have two areas I wanted to ask you about. First of all, one thing that hasn't really been talked about as much is the effect on low-wage workers who were laid off during the occupation because their businesses were closed. Have you dealt with that at all?
Yes. What you'll see in our reports, both of them actually, is a common theme with a lot of folks who live within the red zone or those who work in the red zone, where there was a significant amount of people who lost wages. And as a result of the way leadership viewed the occupation, folks weren't able to, access employment at EI. The story around the Rideau Center being closed and the economic ripple effects of that within the local community, not only from a wages standpoint, but then even the fact that people working in those spaces created space for other people to access and just to have access to community. It all is like intertwined. And so absolutely. And so when we talk about long-term impacts, we're talking about people who may have missed rent, that might have long-term issues with their access to housing, who may have not been able to afford resources. These were things that happened as a result of the convoy and through conversations we had with individuals as well with business owners.
Actually, you had people testifying to that at hearings of your commission.
Yes, we did.
Okay, great. Now, I also wanted to ask you about the involvement of military and police, presumably not in actually as military police, but members or ex-members in the convoy. I know I saw, for example, on Saturday, a person dressed in full military uniform up on the hill, and I know that there was certainly reports of military involvement, and that you also mentioned somewhere in your report about the amount of organization that might be almost called military. Could you maybe expand a bit more about the involvement of off-duty or ex-military and police people in the occupation?
We did hear people raise those concerns. They were witnessing it or they were hearing reports about it. I think it's important to remember that our mandate was very focused on hearing from the community about what they were witnessing and experiencing. We did not have a mandate, nor did we have legal powers to be digging into the composition of the convoy organizers or leadership, etc. But people were very aware of it. And I think it all does feed into, to a certain degree, this is part of what leads to that finding we have made that indeed this was an occupation, is that there were, not to at all suggest that this is close to some sort of formal military occupation, but that there were aspects of how this was playing out that did speak to deliberate organization, that did almost have a sort of militarized supply lines, et cetera, feel to it. And that added to people's own personal conclusions that this is no ordinary provocative confrontational demonstration. This is something very qualitatively different. And I think all of those little pieces are cumulative in leading to those conclusions.
Sorry, I had one other quick question. I understand that the Commission had been asking for donations and you were supported by the community, the CCHC. How did you actually meet your goals of donations to support the work of the Commission?
Actually, fortunately, the commissioners aren't involved at that level. We've been very focused on the hearings. Perhaps I could suggest in follow-up that someone involved in the steering committee or from the Health Centre could answer that for you.
Hi, Bruce Deachman at the Ottawa Citizen. My first question is, you had mentioned there were 2 hearings devoted to supporters of the convoy, and then I understand there were a couple of other supporters who came into other hearings. Do you have an idea of how many supporters there were out of the roughly 200 that you heard from?
I can't remember the quantity. I think we were roughly estimating it was around 10%, but that's not precise, but it's in that ballpark.
Okay. And I had a couple of questions that maybe more are about your experience. And I think the most serious charge that you found is this colossal human rights failure. At what point did you realize that was what you were dealing with?
I think from the beginning, from the first time when we had the hearing, we had, even though the first hearing there was, I think, 1 or 2 people who were pro-convoy, but the majority we have heard, I think, some a very short video, someone who came and testified and gave us a sense of the noise level. Some other were talking. Those people, they didn't know each other, and they kind of gave us almost the same picture of what we heard, and we realized that this is like, among each other, I think it was very, very difficult to hear those stories. At many times, we felt that we really needed to have either a break or, and even for people who were listening, we had some mental support available. So absolutely, yeah, from the beginning, we realized that there was some serious violation of human rights happening during that occupation.
Yeah, and I'd echo what my colleague Monia mentioned, that from the early onset of the hearings, not only did you hear it, but you felt it from the individuals who not only experienced this, but their choice to come and share that in public forums, some folks also privately, but you just felt the emotion as they were recounting their stories, and some people telling the stories of actually having to leave their home and have to coordinate with community members who live in either the suburbs or even outside of the Ottawa area, that people felt that they had to leave their homes in order to feel safe. And I think that speaks again to that human rights violation, that if you can't even stay in the home that is supposed to give you safety. What does that say, right? And so I think an interesting part of this as well is that many of these public hearings were recorded and so easily accessible for folks to watch them or hear them on YouTube. And I think I would encourage folks too, if they really want to get a sense of that human rights violation and the emotional impact on residents, is to definitely take a look at many of the video recordings.
Okay.
And I would add, I totally agree, it was from day one. I know for me personally, very early on, a crucial moment was a set of hearings we had focusing on people with disabilities. And we heard account after account from people for whom essential services had ended overnight. Transit was no longer available. Programs that were essential to the provision of medical assistance, food, meals, just stopped. And there was a real aha moment, I think, for all of us at that stage as to what a disgraceful human rights failure that was and how much it spoke to the fact that human rights were not guiding anyone's thinking about how to respond to this. Because if it was, none of that would ever have been okay. It would have been, yes, perhaps a reality that transit's going to be disrupted, or maybe even transit it's being delivered through Ottawa Paratranspo would have had to ended. But then something else would have been put in place. The police would have stepped in to ensure that there was security to keep those basics going. That was a real moment for me.
And last,
Sorry, I'll just add, and I'm sorry to
Don't
belabor
be
it, but so I've traveled the world, as has Alex and maybe my other colleagues, taking human rights testimonies from people in a variety of circumstances. I admit, when I agreed to be a commissioner, I wasn't sure what the nature of the testimonies would be, the gravity. And as my colleagues have said, early on it became, the very first hearing actually, it became exceptionally clear how grave the violations of human rights were for residents in the red zone and outside of the red zone. I actually found the level of abandonment, as Alex has eloquently spoken about, shocking. And in light of the resources of the city, the province, and the nation, in light of the sophisticated democracy we call ourselves, the simplest things weren't done. I mean, the simplest things. I recounted to my colleagues that when COVID hit, I have a family member in Germany, and he's elderly and quite vulnerable. And as soon as COVID hit, he's in a building of seniors who are in this vulnerable position. The German government in the province that he lives in immediately sent people out to the building to make sure people had access to food, that they were okay, medicines, etc. I was shocked to learn that not a single government official mapped the red zone, figured out who was living where. We have entire buildings that are purpose-built for persons with disabilities. Never mapped the city, never figured out that the 3 drop-in centers in Ottawa are in the red zone. I mean, this to me was what brought it home to me, this like complete abandonment of the simplest things.
And by the way, we have an emergency plan in the city, and that could have been basically started, but it was not. We had it, we have seen that response, we have seen it when we had the floodings, we have seen it, and they checked on the elderly and they checked on the disabled. So it's not that we don't have, it has not been enabled, it has not been used. And we wonder why, and this is going to be probably the question, the answer will be in our second report.
And my last thing is, during your time as commissioners, was there anything that really surprised you?
So, leadership. And I really talk about leadership, and we often talk about, where does it start? Is it from the top down? Is it bottom up? And I think many of the aha moments that my colleagues and I have spoken about the thing for me that is even reflected in my personal reflection in the report, and I think in the final report that we have will show in the recommendations, that there is something around the culture of leadership in the city and across the country that played a role in many of the failures that we saw. And I think it was the biggest shocker to me that, as someone who has witnessed the response to activists who've been working on social justice from police, for example, I've seen that response. I know it very intimately. I've seen the level of vindictiveness that often is shown to people who try to hold the city accountable. When I see that same level of vindictiveness shown at some of the most well-respected people who don't fit the stereotypical activists who were trying to support the city, when I saw that, that was the biggest surprise to me. And it told me that there is a cultural issue with leadership in this country that needs to be addressed. And I think definitely something that I would like to speak to on from a recommendation standpoint on how we imagine leadership and how we as citizens can play a role in who leads us is an important question if we want to be able to take the lessons we've learned from this occupation and actually bring forth change.
To a certain degree, sadly, no, I wasn't surprised. But at the same time, yes, every single day, every single session we had, I was surprised. I was surprised and amazed by the courage of the incredible array of people who came forward, many of them in public sessions. I think as a takeaway, perhaps the thing that has been the most surprising for me is how pervasive it was. And pervasive in many respects, not just in terms of numbers and quantity, but across the entire human rights front. It's almost hard to think of or name a human rights concern that wasn't, for some people, and sometimes for significant numbers of people, imperiled. And pervasive also in the sense that no one was safe. Obviously, I think our gravest concern is the degree to which the most marginalized and vulnerable members of the community were at the greatest risk and did suffer the greatest harms. But we heard from privileged individuals living in very comfortable circumstances in the middle of Centertown who also were experiencing harms, endured the violence, lived fear every single day. No one was safe from what happened.
Thank you.
I think the thing that struck me, I agree with what my colleague said. All of those things really struck me or surprised me. I think maybe the thing that's just unbelievable is the absolute failure of governments to engage and listen to the people who were at ground zero in the red zone or trying to access the red zone, who had ideas of what needed to happen, who had ideas of how they could be helped. And just the complete, wall not engaging the people of Ottawa in a meaningful way.
Thank you.
I remember two instances where I was quite surprised, I think in the kind of, when some residents were saying, I felt embarrassed to be Canadian. It was one of the first time in my life. And again, I think it's like Alex, those are not people who are underprivileged. These are what we call middle class kind of privileged Canadian, I would say. And then the second one, when someone said, for someone who trusted the police all my life, this is the first time I did not trust the police. And you hear that among many disadvantaged communities. And but I think to hear it being said from someone who did not look at all disadvantage, that was a big surprise for me.
Thanks very much.
Well, I believe that concludes our session for today. I'd like to thank very sincerely the work of our commissioners, and as well as the tireless work that happens behind the scenes of our staff and our volunteers, and really the crucial support we get from the Centertown Community Health Center. As we've mentioned a few times, our second report is going to be coming out in late March, so stay tuned. You can find our Part 1 of our report on our website at opc-cpo.ca, and the Commission staff and volunteers are available for anyone who is looking to request an interview or for some backup information. Feel free to reach out to myself or Rachel at the back over there, who is waving. And on that note, I wish you all a pleasant Monday, and be safe.